The following program, General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It is one of that series of programs wherein General Grant lifts up a person, place, or events in the war for review and reflection. It is available on the free YouTube channel, Dr. E.C. Fields, on Facebook under Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted and indeed is encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. This program is the third in a series of three about the issues of contrabands in the war. The first segment was the early days, what are we to do with them? The second segment was what are we doing with them? And this segment is what did we do with them and what of the future? I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, and I should like to reflect with you about the issue and the problems of contrabands in the war. What are we to do with them? What did we do with them? And in this reflection, talking about end of war and into the future, what is to be done, what is to happen to the now freed contrabands. The date of January 16th, 1865 is significant because the war is nearly over, ending April the 9th, and General Sherman is in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, and dealing with a large number of now emancipated slaves into the thousands. And he, given the guidelines of the day and what we were doing with the contrabands, issued his special order number 15. And that was to take the lands of the Georgia Sea Islands and the inland coastal rice country, low country of South Carolina, and ran from just south of Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida and all of the Georgia coast. Went about 30 miles inland and some 400,000 acres of land. So he declared in that order that they were to move, or they would have the lands of the Sea Islands and the low country rice country, and they could farm it, and suggested that they be divided into 40-acre parcels, and that the Army would see what it could do to get loans of mules. And that, I suspect, is where the worn out expression 40 acres and a mule. Now, mules were never promised. The Army said that they would try to find mules, and the blacks relocated to the Sea Islands and the Low Country could begin to farm that 40 acres. And at that time, it was thought that a redistribution of land would occur and they could stay there. However, they were urged to get proper title to the lands, and 1,551 people did get titles to the land that said they owned it. Now, as a result of Special Order number 15, 40,000 blacks, some 10,000 families, moved into what they were calling Sherman's Land, the Georgia Sea Islands and the low country, rice country, South Carolina coast, about 30 miles inland. And on Sherman's Land, from some 400,000 acres, 40,000 people, 10,000 families began farming. On March the 3rd of 1865, an act was passed that established the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Now, there was quite a fight getting it through Congress, and I think it noteworthy that Senator Charles Sumner actively advocated, fought to have a cabinet level department created with the Secretary of the Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands reporting to the president. Now, it's one of the few times I expect Senator Sumner has not gotten what he wanted, but they passed the act, and moreover, it was only supposed to last for a year. It was never intended to be a permanent entity or organization. And Sherman has said since then he never intended for these 40-acre plots to become permanent lands. They were temporary housing to stow thousands of black people that he could not feed and care for and move an army to, which goes back to the original problem. We are armies. We're not social service agencies. We are not set up to feed and clothe and care for people who are not in the army, and we're always on the move. But as of March the 3rd of 1865, the act was established that set up the freedmen, and it grew out of the Department of the Freedmen that was established back in the fall of 62. The next date of significance is May the 29th of 1865. At that time, President Johnson had issued his manifesto about pardoning former rebels, and with some 13 exceptions. But he began to pardon our former Confederate adversaries in alarming, unbelievable rates. And pretty much anybody who was willing to take the oath was able to get a pardon, and that entitled him to reclaim any lands he had abandoned. So as of the end of May into April and spring of 65, President Johnson is pardoning everybody who's applying for an exemption or under one of those 13 exemptions. And in June of 65, we've established that there are about 40,000 blacks in Sherman's land there off the Georgia coast, South Carolina to northern Florida near Jacksonville. In July of 65, General O.O. Howard, who has been appointed the director of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, he was known as the Christian General. He lost an arm in the fight early in the war and is known to be a really fine man in character, and he is. So he issued circular number 13 over the Bureau that said that the people inhabiting these 40-acre plots should apply for title to them as quickly as possible. I suspect General Howard knew that President Johnson was going to intervene in some way. He knew the pardons were flying thick and fast. So he was urging his people in the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands to, as quickly as possible, divide those lands into 40-acre plots and apply for the title to them to prohibit them being taken back by their former owners. Well, in October of 65, General Howard went to Edisto Island, one of the sea islands, to meet with those folks that were there in what they're now calling Sherman's land, to tell them, you're going to have to move. You've got to vacate. He was unsuccessful in opposing people being displaced, because the key factor is that when a former Confederate officer or anyone opposing the Union in the late war took the pledge, then they were pardoned, and they were entitled to reclaim the land that they had abandoned. So all these some 800,000 acres of land that have been abandoned in the war, their owners are now eligible, and many are coming back to reclaim them. The black people, for example, in Sherman's land, as they were calling it, the Sea Islands. That's exemplary of what was happening throughout the South, because they're now being told you've got to vacate the land, or you can renegotiate a labor contract with the former owner, which would be the former, in most cases, many if not most cases, the former slave owner, negotiating now with his former slaves. And oddly enough, that was developed into year-long labor contracts, which is something else that smells bad about this arrangement. But General Howard decided to go himself to speak with them, and he met him on Edisto Island, South Carolina, in 1865, and they had a 3-day meeting, and he was trying to persuade them as affably as he could to vacate the land or renegotiate with the former owner. And they wrote him a letter. Their leaders got together and wrote him a letter that I should like to read you, and because I think it poignant. They wrote to General Howard, "General, we want homesteads. We were promised homesteads by the government. If it does not carry out the promise its agents made to us, if the government, having concluded to befriend its late enemies and to neglect to observe the principles of common faith between itself and us, its allies in the war that you said was over, now takes away from them all right to the soil they stand upon, save such as they can get by again working for your late and their all-time enemies. We are left in a more unpleasant condition than our former. You will see this is not the condition of really free men. You ask us to forgive the landowners of our island. You only lost your right arm in war and might forgive them. The man who tied me to a tree and gave me 39 lashes, and who stripped and flogged my mother and my sister, and who will not let me stay in his empty hut, except I will do his planting and be satisfied with his price, and who combines with others to keep away land for me or from me, well, knowing that I would not have anything to do with him if I had land of my own, that man I cannot well forgive. Does it look as if he has forgiven me, seeing how he tries to keep me in a condition of helplessness? So that was a very difficult time for General Howard, but he told them he had to. You've got to vacate this land or renegotiate a contract with your former owner. In October, now that was in July, or rather that was October of 65. In February of 66, Congress had renegotiated and repassed an extension of the Freedmen's Act. Now recall, it was only supposed to be for a year and not a permanent institution, but they have repassed a new Freedmen's Bill. President Johnson, after he had said he would approve it, vetoed it, which shocked Congress on both sides for a couple of reasons. He had told them he was going to sign it and vetoed it. Moreover, the veto, with President Johnson being the 17th president, had only been used before he used it with this 6 times, but it would be used 15 times before he was out of office. 6 times from 16 presidents, but more than 15 times from President Johnson, which indicates the difficulties he had with Congress. And when Congress, they put through another bill, and he vetoed that one. So they came together and put through another bill and overrode that second veto. So after the veto was overridden. It was clear that President Johnson and the Congress were at loggerheads that probably was not going to be resolved, and may well end in an impeachment. There's certainly enough talk about that. But President Johnson then issued Circular number 15, which orders the land returned to the original owners. Now, these are the people who opposed us in the war. They've taken the oath, they've been pardoned, entitled then to regain the lands that they had abandoned, that had lain fallow, the lands that the blacks have moved into, began farming. We're told in good faith, this is get the title to this land, so it will be yours, and you're going to be able to farm your 40 acres. Only 1,551, though, for example, as I said earlier, of the 40,000 in the Sea Islands, in Sherman's Land, as they called it, actually applied for a title. And many of those still were cheated out of their land, and they had to get 20-acre plots and negotiate contracts with their former masters, because they had no way to make a living. They had no way of subsistence, so they were at the mercy of their former owners, who now have the land back. In July 25th of 1868, Congress cut the funds to the Bureau in more legislation and essentially gutted it. They had to release many of their agents, and while they have been working with healthcare and hospitals and in judicial proceedings, martial courts, to resolve legal issues, the teaching, the social welfare applications, and it's the first social welfare agency we have ever had in our government, this legislation. And President Johnson had vetoed it on the basis that, largely on the basis that he didn't like the military keeping the peace in peacetime, that he thought that was an unconstitutional provision, that the armies of the occupation Reconstruction shouldn't be keeping the peace. But in July of 1868, the 25th of July, funds were substantially cut, and many of the agents were no longer there, and of all the social services, relocation, housing, medical, legal help, counseling for relocation, all of that came to a halt, and the only two functions left essentially were the education and the helping to settle claims. And most instances, that did not go well for the former slave. And the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was, for all intents and purposes, dead. And at this time in 1868, it doesn't look like it will survive much longer. That remains to be seen. The difficulties, though, Reconstruction angst is growing, and the Southerners are striving for what they call redemption, to reclaim their lands. The former contrabands and then freedmen, many United States colored troop soldiers, many sailors in the United States Navy, their future is very uncertain as the president becomes at cross purposes with Congress. We don't know where he wants to go in his proposals, although he has said that treason must be made odious and the traitor to suffer, and the South trying to get back what it had pre-war, so and occupation of troops or troops stationed in the South in a Reconstruction military occupation. There is much angst, much anger, and sadly not much healing going on. But to give you an illustration of the service of the former blacks that became soldiers and sailors, there were 180,000 black men to serve as United States colored troops. There were 18,000 black men who served in the United States Navy. There were, of those approximately 200,000, there were 40,000 to die in wartime. And of that 40,000, 30,000 of them died due to disease. As with all the other soldiers, there were at least 2 to 1 disease to combat related deaths. So they did the ones that could serve, and they strived to do well. As far as maintaining a semblance of order for the newly freed slaves and now citizens, and trying to make their own way in a society, I should like to tell you the numbers of the soldiers that were in the Army. As of May the 1st of 1865, 3 weeks after the war was over, there were 1 million men under arms in the United States Army. By June the 30th of 1865, 2 months later, there were only 152,000 men in the United States Army. We were discharging them and mustering them out as fast as we could because it was costing a fortune to pay those soldiers, and we were suffering heavily from war debt. And in the fall of 1866, the United States Army was down to approximately 38,000 men. And most of them were out west on the frontier, involved in frontier protection patrol and in the Indian Wars. So May 65, there are 1 million men. June 30, July 1st of 65, 152,000 men. And in fall of 66, 38,000 men, most of them out west. So there weren't many soldiers occupying the South to be of service and protection for the newly freed blacks who were striving to become citizens. I don't know where it will all end or how these problems will be resolved. But in these 3 reflections that I have had with you in looking at the Civil War, specifically with contrabands, I have addressed with you what we did, how we led up to the contraband issue, and what to do with them. What are we to do with them, the question, and General Butler and his Fortress Monroe Doctrine. What we did with them during the war when I appointed Chaplain John Eaton as the man in charge of the contrabands in my command there in and around Shiloh and Corinth, Mississippi, later to become superintendent of all of the contraband agents working in the Army. And into what we have talked about today in the reflections about the timeline from January of 65, when Sherman issued Order Number 15, putting 40,000 freed blacks on lands in the Georgia Sea Islands, and which can be generalized to all of the lands throughout the South that had been abandoned, and what to do with blacks that were now free. Until July of 68, when, for all intents and purposes, the Freedmen's Bureau of Refugees and Abandoned Lands was essentially disemboweled and made largely ineffective. I think it noteworthy to lift up that Charles Sumner wanted and advocated strongly for the Bureau to be a cabinet-level permanent department in the United States government. But having looked at the contrabands from before the war, what to do with them when the war started, up until reviewing in 1868 when the Bureau has largely been rendered impotent, I will bring these reflections to a close. And until we meet again, I am General of the Armies Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you farewell.